Today we're talking to F. William Engdahl, the author of several books, among them Gods of Money, Wall Street, and The Death of American Century. And he is also a political risk consultant. So we're going to discuss several of the most burning political and economic issues in the world today. Mr. Engdahl, thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
To start off, basically, never before has the world faced so many economic and political problems all at the same time. Would you say that these conflicts, which we're seeing today, in terms of euro and the dollar situation, and what's happening in Northern Africa and in the Middle East, do these conflicts feed off each other? Are they somehow related, or not particularly?
What I see in all of these conflicts, the decision to bomb Libya, the crisis with the dollar, the crisis with the American economy, and the conduct of American foreign policy in the last period is all part of a breakdown of an entire superpower structure that was built up after the end of the World War II. And nobody in Washington wants to admit, just as nobody in Britain 100 years ago wanted to admit that the British Empire was in terminal decline. All of this is related to the attempt to keep this sole superpower not only intact, but to spread its influence over the rest of the planet. And that, not surprisingly, much of the world is not too eager to see that.
So would you say that what's happening in the Middle East or in Northern Africa right now is basically an attempt on the behalf of the United States to keep its game up?
Very much so. The plan was first announced by George W. Bush when he was president, just after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 at a G8 meeting, and it was called the Greater Middle East Project. And that project, they published a map of what they had in mind, was the control and the democratization, as they call it, of the entire Islamic world from Afghanistan, Pakistan, down through Iran, Syria, the Persian Gulf area, the oil-producing states there, and across North Africa all the way to Morocco. And the events, the so-called Arab Spring, have been planned years back, and the instigators of those so-called spontaneous protests, these Twitter revolts in Cairo and Tunisia and so forth over the last months, have all been pre-organized assiduously. Some of the people, leaders of the protests, have been trained in Belgrade in Serbia by Otpor activists financed by the U.S. State Department. This thing has State Department and U.S. intelligence all over it. And why are they doing this? Well, two things in my view. One, there is vast wealth in the hands of the leading circles in the Arab world. Vast wealth. Sovereign wealth funds of countries like Kuwait and other countries, but also just the resources. And one of the agendas is to introduce, as was done in the Soviet Union after 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the agenda of IMF privatization, free market economy, and so forth, so that Western banks and financial agencies and corporations could come in and take the plunder. The second agenda is militarily, in places such as Libya or South Sudan, now the so-called Republic of South Sudan, to militarize those oil sources that are directly strategic to China's future economic growth. So this is all about controlling Eurasia, something Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about back in 1997 in his famous book, The Grand Chess Game. And controlling especially Russia and China and any potential cohesion of the Eurasian countries economically and politically.
But as a result of the so-called Arab Spring, can we honestly say that Middle East and Northern African countries, which have gone through with the changes, have they really become more democratic?
Egyptian and Tunisian friends of mine say that it's just the opposite. The economy is in far worse shape. Libya had the highest living standard in all of Africa before the bombings of NATO. Today, the country is in ruins because of those bombings, not because of Gaddafi. The economy of Egypt is in dire straits. The military remains in control. The military high command of Egypt was sitting in the Pentagon when the revolts kicked off and waited for a signal from the Pentagon when to return and take control of those events.
So will the instigators of the conflicts, who seem to be, the United States and maybe some of the European powers, if we, look at Libya, will they be able to restore normality in these countries, or is it not even in their interest?
I don't think they give a moment's thought to normality or normalization. I think what their concern is, especially the Pentagon, is military control. The next step will be in this so-called Transitional National Council in Libya is to have that puppet government give NATO permanent basing rights inside Libya, something they never had before under Gaddafi. South Sudan, a similar thing. They're defenseless unless they have NATO forces in there. The AFRICOM is coordinating this, the Pentagon's Africa Command, which was, interestingly enough, created just after China's 2006 Africa diplomacy, where 40 heads of African nations were invited to Beijing, and enormous deals were signed with the Chinese companies for oil exploration, to build hospitals, give soft loans, everything the IMF didn't do in Africa in the last 30 years. The Chinese began doing, and that had enormous results for China.
I know that you have a very interesting opinion on this. Who would you say pays for wars waged by the United States?
Well, you have to go back to the role in the last 20 or 30 years, actually it began in the 80s, with the role of the dollar as world reserve currency. And China has an enormous trade surplus. Walmart is essentially an outpost of Chinese manufacturing in America today. So the 300 billion plus of surplus dollars that the Central Bank of China amasses every year, what do you do with that? Well, there's few markets big enough to invest in. Supposedly they could buy gold for their central bank reserves, which they are doing, by the way. But the only place they can invest it, as they see it right now, or until very recently, is either in dollars or in the euro. They've got something like $3 trillion of US dollar treasury bonds or bills as their reserves today. So in effect, the US would not be able to finance the deficits that they're running to wage those wars in Afghanistan or wage those wars in Iraq or in Libya unless the Chinese were buying US Treasury bonds. So ironically, the Chinese are financing wars directed against Chinese national interests for energy security.
Would you say the United States is going to, has any chance of resurfacing from the crisis that it's finding itself in right now?
The only way, as they see it, they can survive and keep the dollar as their instrument, Wall Street I'm talking about, is the gods of money, as I call it in my book, is to find new areas of loot. So the Arab Spring is directed against grabbing and privatizing the vast wealth of the Arab oil world and the Arab world generally, just as the use of the IMF in the former Soviet Union was consciously designed by Wall Street and by Washington in order to plunder the vast resources of Russia and the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries.
So if the dollar does not retain its superior status, do you think there is any likelihood that the euro will retain it, or inherit it rather?
Well, one reason that there's this difficulty with Greece and these so-called Eurozone weaker economies is that this is part of a kind of a covert financial warfare between the dollar and the euro as reserve currency. It started when the Chinese started complaining publicly about the flawed economic policy of Washington, running up deficits and endangering the value of Chinese treasury bonds. So now, just when that became public, suddenly there was a Greek crisis, and the Greek crisis was put in place in 2002 before Greece entered the Eurozone by none other than Goldman Sachs, the most powerful bank in America, arguably today, politically well connected in Washington. So it's very clear if you follow the money trail that the Greek crisis was programmed to be detonated at command by Wall Street and the US Treasury as well as the Federal Reserve in order to defend the reserve currency role of the US dollar. But I don't see the European economies endangered as the US because one great difference, Europe still produces things. Europe still has real industry.
Would you believe that, from going back to the beginning of our interview, would you believe that there are some European countries which benefit from the situation unraveling, say, in Libya right now, like France?
Well, I was just going to say, Sarkozy had a meeting in March when the whole drama in Libya kicked off. He invited leaders of this so-called Transitional National Council to Paris and made them whispered sweet nothings in their ears about having control of the oil resources of eastern Libya, and poured money, weapons. The CIA and the French intelligence have been pouring arms into these insurgent groups inside Libya. This is an armed insurrection financed by NATO countries in Libya. It's no peaceful Twitter revolution of a bunch of kids who have a dream of American-style democracy or something. This is raw power grab by the French.
What do you predict, or in your opinion, what do you think will happen in Libya now? I mean, the NATO troops will have to pull out at some point, and then what?
Well, will they? I imagine an Iraq-like scenario, or Afghanistan. What do you have in Afghanistan? You have 17 permanent U.S. military bases in Afghanistan, most of them air bases, who are not bombing the Taliban. They're preparing for a coming war in perhaps 10 years with China, or maybe with Russia. They've got a military bastion in the heart of Central Asia. That's something that they never had during the Cold War. So I think Libya is destined for a similar treatment.
What role do you think Russia should play in the events which are unraveling right now?
I think Russia, given the history going back more than the Cold War era, Russia can play a very stabilizing role as a counterforce to this highly dangerous strategy of the Greater Middle East project of NATO and the US in that region. Russia can play a very important role blocking some untoward events from the side of the UN Security Council in Syria. I don't think China would agree, as they did on the Libya case, to a UN sanction action in Syria. But in more ways than that, Russia can play a very constructive role, I think, in the region to try to counter this destabilization. I would hope they do.
Mr. Engdahl, thank you very much for your time.